The Unmarked by Matt Fleagle. Chapter 3. The Sacred Tree. Kaleb dropped his cart and spun around, trying to determine where the commotion was coming from. After a few moments, he decided that the scream had erupted from the east end of Glenwood Village. Just then, another scream rang out, followed by more hysterical shouts. The noises confirmed Kaleb's notion that the crisis had arisen at the east end of the village. Kaleb left his cart and raced back through the brush of the forest that fringed the village, circling the town until he reached the east gate. He had almost come upon the banquet hall. While dodging trees and bushes, he noticed out of the corner of his eye that someone was sprinting through the woods to his right, some 40 yards away. It looked like a blur of black clothing, but he could not identify the runner as male or female. Nor did he care, since the confused cries of villagers grew louder before him. When Kaleb broke through the tree line and stepped into the courtyard that stretched out in front of the village banquet hall, he observed pure chaos. Decorative banners half pinned to the thatched roof of the banquet hall were hanging listlessly near the ladders being used to drape them. A cluster of grown men were gesturing wildly at each other and peering at the thick trees surrounding the village. Two women held each other on the opposite side of the unfenced courtyard surrounding the building, one of them crying. Another man had 3 or 4 children hedged around him under the threshold of the doorway into the banquet hall. His arms were wrapped around them like thick, protective vines. Forgetting his place as an unmarked, Kaleb rushed toward the cluster of men and women outside of the banquet hall. Every voice in the circle seemed to rise higher than the previous one, making their conversation garbled. Then he came out of nowhere. He was headed for the tree. I saw him. Yes, but where did he come from? Who last saw him? Did anyone see him? Said one man, breaking out of the circle of frantic men and addressing the throngs of villagers arriving at the scene. Kaleb listened hard to the fractured conversation, but he couldn't determine who the men were talking about. No one in the crowd of villagers seemed willing or able to offer useful information about the alleged intruder. Only that some man with a sword, dressed in black, had run through the square, knocked over a woman who collided with him, and then disappeared into the woods. Kaleb wondered whether the figure he had just crossed in the woods was the very intruder they were speaking of. It was the Renders, all right. I've been warning you all for years to take note of them. They're up to something, said one grizzled old man, just hobbling up to the agitated crowd. You foolish old man, said someone else in the circle. The Stone Renders haven't stepped foot in our village for 10 years. What business would they have with us other than an interest in our crops, which we've already sold them? That's what I'm saying. They're after something else, or they wouldn't be creeping around the village square, said the old man. Just after he said this, a woman, weeping loudly and dragging her young girl in tow, emerged from the woods near the far end of the banquet hall. Elders! Elders! She called loudly as she raced up to them. What is it, Cecilia? Said the man who had peppered the crowd with questions about the intruder. Oh, it's horrible. The sacred tree. Someone in black found it and he tore off one of the limbs. He did what? Shouted another man in the crowd. We were walking past the sacred tree, my daughter and I, she said, and I saw him, dressed in black, shiny clothes he was. A drove of curious people rushed into the woods before she could finish her report. They swatted branches aside, trying their best not to trample each other on their way. Finally, the horde of panting villagers broke into the clearing a few hundred yards away from the village square. At the sight of the sacred tree, loud gasps broke out in every direction. Sobs went up from some of the women at the center of the gathering. Kaleb stumbled into the clearing at the tail end of the crowd. His eyes followed the bewildered gazes of his people. Near the base of the giant tree, a small limb had been coarsely cut off. The Dellbloods gasped together again. Many stood paralyzed, their shaking hands clasped over their mouths for some time. Each Dellblood including Kaleb, had the image of that sacred tree, each knot in its beautiful wood and each twig extending out from its boughs, impressed into their memories from the time they could walk. Neither gale nor lightning had ever torn a single limb from the trunk of the sacred tree in the decades since any of them were born. They never imagined a limb could be separated from that great towering tree. This mysterious tree had for centuries remained at the center of the villagers' worship. Each year, the Dellbloods placed offerings of grains, orchid fruits, and vegetables at the base of the tree, hoping an attentive forest spirit would provide Glenwood's villagers a rich harvest in the year to come. Kaleb found himself as confounded by this harrowing sight as any other villager standing at the base of the massive tree. Though, in fairness, Kaleb had cause to hate that tree as much as his fellow Dellbloods revered it. For it was this very tree that burned an intricate image into each infant's forehead on the night the baby was laid at its roots to receive the sacred Dellblood mark. The process was painless, mysterious. That the mark would be given was a foregone conclusion for every child laid at its roots, save one child, in roughly a generation. It was the sacred tree which had condemned Kaleb, that once-in-a-generation exception to the ancient rule, to a life of solitude, by refusing to mark his forehead on the night his parents laid him between the tree's massive roots. That one feature of Kaleb's early life, one he could neither remember nor control, had set into motion the loneliness, shame, and exile that overshadowed his young life. Glenwood's villagers held this landmark in such high regard that they never thought to place anyone nearby to guard it. For the tree had always seemed indestructible to them, as all worshipful things seem to the men that reverence them. The sturdy, towering trunk and broad, leafy canopy of the sacred tree was a fixture of eternal power, of permanence, of the magic that built and ordered the Dellbloods' world. And yet, now, there it was before them, marred by a blade. Their sacred symbol had been crudely defaced. One of the villagers' oldest men, its head elder, finally pushed his way to the front of the crowd, thick cane in hand. He took one look at the sacred tree, and then broke the numb silence that hung over the villagers. "Who did this?" he thundered. When no one answered, he shouted again, even louder, "Who did this?" No one answered him for some time. Then one of the men near the head elder lifted his hairy arm and pointed in the direction of the woman who had first summoned them all into the clearing. "That woman over there, she says she saw a man, arrayed in black with shining metal, lurking here by the tree." The head elder pivoted toward her. "Is this true?" the elder, whose name was Fearless, said to her. The crowd nudged the woman in question out of the sea of dumbstruck citizens and pushed her toward Fearless. "I did, Your Grace. My daughter and I were passing here as we made our way to the banquet hall, and we saw him through the trees. He saw us and retreated into the woods." "Had he cut the branch? Did you see him holding it?" "No, not that we could tell," she said in a faint voice, as though she feared a punishment simply for witnessing the offense. "But we saw that the branch was missing after the intruder disappeared." "And you're sure this intruder was dressed in black fabric and shiny armor?" "Yes, Your Grace, he was." Fearless became silent. He kicked a rock by his feet and groaned. His eyes roved the surrounding trees as though looking for clues. "The Dellblood Council will convene tonight," he finally said, a broken edge in his voice. "The banquet will have to wait." "Your Grace, what will we do about the tree? Who will make sure it is not defaced again?" said one of the younger men standing at the front of the crowd. Fearless reached up to scratch his thinning but still blond head. "Where is the unmark?" he said. The crowd shuffled around as old and young Dellbloods alike swiveled from left to right, searching for Kaleb. They finally spotted the outcast at the back of the crowd, where he had observed the entire episode, quietly. One of them pushed him roughly from behind. "Get up there, fool," the man who nudged him said. "The head elder wants to talk to you." Kaleb stepped out of the sea of people. He felt the heat of humiliation against his skin as he crossed the clearing. While approaching the head elder, he made sure to keep his head bent toward the earth, in proper deference. Snickers and whispers followed him all the way. Yet Kaleb barely noticed. He had grown used to these noises. "You, UNMARKED," Fairless said when Kaleb reached him. "You will stay here by the tree tonight. Sound an alarm in the village if the intruder returns, or if anyone attempts to molest the sacred tree again." "Yes, Your Grace," said Kaleb softly. He wanted to protest the elder's order, knowing that his people were superstitious about visiting the sacred site in the dark of night. None of them would have dared to stay in this clearing past sunset, unless absolutely necessary. Yet it was no matter at all for the Dellbloods to consign Kaleb to this undesirable job. Fairless and his subjects would not give a second thought to leaving Kaleb by the defaced tree for the entire night, enveloped in darkness, with a dangerous invader still at large somewhere near Glenwood Village. "Sir," Kaleb said to Fairless. "What?" droned the head elder, impatient that an exile might pose a question to him. "If the intruder appears and comes against me with his sword, what should I do?" The head elder signaled to a young man nearby. "Go fetch the boy's axe." He turned back to Kaleb, a wrinkled grin at the corners of his old mouth as he said, "I should think you've done enough log splitting in your days to make a weapon out of that blade in a pinch." Kaleb nodded. Fairless sighed and turned back toward the village, hobbling slowly into the woods between the sacred tree and the village square. The rest of the crowd dispersed into small clusters of shuffling bodies, muttering quietly to themselves and shaking their heads as they made their way back toward town, until Kaleb found himself alone in the dim clearing. Kaleb stretched his tired back muscles and settled himself at the base of the sacred tree, waiting for his axe.